In the opening weeks of the battle for hearts and minds and votes. The AMA has been responsible for many of those headlines, with our strong views on Medicare freeze, the PBS, rural health, Indigenous health, and even this conference. Health policy, good or bad, is a vote changer. Health policy affects every Australian in some way, every day of their lives. One of the key drivers to change health policy is media coverage and media scrutiny, and it is groups like the AMA that play an important role in this process. We launch and promote our own policies, and equally importantly, we provide our own commentary on the health policies of governments and oppositions. We play an important role in influencing how the public, the voters, react to the respective health platforms of the major parties, especially at election time, but also in those years between elections. We do not allow governments to get complacent, nor do we allow them to rest easy with bad policy. And that has been very much the case for the last 2 years. Since Budget Night 2014, the AMA has had little choice but to highlight the shortcomings in health policy, from the co-payment, Mark 1 and 2, to the freeze, to public hospital funding. Our relationship with the media is key to our success in getting our message out. We also take a few hits from the media along the way. But overall, we have a relationship based on mutual respect, integrity, and good stories. So, how is health playing out in the 2016 election? Today, we are privileged to have 5 of the most highly regarded journalists in the country to share their views with us. They have taken time out from their busy schedules of watching closely as Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten crisscross the country, desperately seeking certainty. This morning, we will meet the press with AMA insiders. Our guests will provide us with a conversational commentary of how this election campaign is going, and how important health will be in winning or losing votes. It's my pleasure to introduce this morning's moderator and panellists. Our moderator is Paul Bongiorno. Paul is Network 10's contributing editor, a position he has held since he resigned as National Affairs Editor in 2014. Previously, he was the network's Canberra Bureau Chief and political editor for 20 years. He is a regular commentator on ABC Radio National Breakfast and a columnist for the Saturday paper and the New Daily. His musings also appear in the Canberra Weekly. For 17 years, he was executive producer and host of the weekly political program Meet the Press. Paul came to the Canberra Bureau in 1987 from Channel 10 Brisbane. In Brisbane, he covered state politics and established a reputation as an investigative journalist, winning 4 Walkleys. In 1987, Paul was also Queensland correspondent for The Bulletin. Paul has been in television journalism since 1974. He started out with the 7 Network in Melbourne and did a stint at Win TV in Wollongong. You've been around, Paul. And he has a master's degree in theology from the Pontifical Urban University in Rome. Next, we have Sue Dunlevy, veteran health reporter. Sue Dunlevy has covered 11 health ministers and 13 AMA presidents. She's seen one AMA leader sue the health minister and another propose separate waiting rooms for rich and poor patients so the wealthy could pay a higher fee to jump the queue. For nearly 3 decades, she's covered Medicare co-payments and hospital queues, pharmacy profits and private health insurance premium rises. Sue is the national health correspondent for 7 newspapers, including the Daily Telegraph and the Herald Sun, and online news service news.com.au. Sue is joined by Laura Tingle. The Australian Financial Review's political editor, Laura Tingle has spent most of her 35-year career covering federal politics, writing on both economics and politics for The Australian, The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Fin Review. She actually began her career as a junior staffer with the AMA. She is the author of Chasing the Future, a book about the recession of the early 1990s, and 2 quarterly essays, Great Expectations, Government, Entitlement and an Angry Nation, and Political Amnesia, How We Forgot to Govern. She has won 2 Walkley Awards and the Paul Lynham Award for Press Gallery Journalism. Our next panellist is Malcolm Farr. Malcolm is National Political Editor at news.com.au, Australia's most popular online news site. He has worked for a number of newspapers, including the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mirror and the Australian. He regularly appears on the political current affairs program Insiders on ABC TV and has served as president of the Federal Parliamentary Press Gallery. Malcolm is one half of 2 Grumpy Hacks, an entertaining iTunes podcast covering the election. And our final panellist today is Andrew Probyn. Andrew has been the Federal Political Editor and Canberra Bureau Chief for the West Australian since 2005. He has spent almost 15 years in the Federal Press Gallery, first with the Herald Sun. Andrew also spent 2 years working for the ABC in Tasmania as state political reporter. He was the winner of the Press Gallery Journalist of the Year award last year, along with colleague Nick Butterley. Andrew won the Melbourne Press Club's Gold Quill Award in 2001 and is a 3-time winner of the Matt Price Best Columnist Prize at the WA Media Awards. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panel, and I'll now hand over to Paul to start the conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. As I said to you just before we came up on the podium, I'll feel much better after this than I'm feeling at the present moment. I think Churchill once said that all great speakers get very nervous before they give a speech. Me, I feel positively sick. Anyway, I thought to situate this discussion in the most interesting way, perhaps sexy way, is to, right from the top, talk about how the panel sees who is winning the election and who will win the election. And I guess some context for this is the Reachtel poll last night on Channel 7 had two-party preferred 52-48 to Labor's way. And but a sort of a touchstone to reality there was in the swinging seat of Corangamite in Victoria. It was 56-46, the Liberal candidate or the Liberal member's way, which just goes to show that we really can't rely completely on the overall two-party preferred number to work out who's going to win the election. Although, as one of the Liberal marginal seat holders keeps reminding me, that if you have a swing on 4%, 4.5, whatever the average of the polls is, it's got to turn up somewhere. You just can't say, oh, it'll only be in safe Labor seats or safe Liberal seats. The other thing is that what we've seen this week, at the beginning of the week, news polls showed that the percentage of people who think the government will win has fallen 10 points. From 55 to 44. And everybody takes who you think will win the election as a better guide than people telling you who they're going to vote for. And they say the other best guide is what the odds the bookies give. And the bookies are giving quite long odds for Labor at the moment and very short odds for the coalition. But another one of my sources of in fact, someone who's lost his seat and regained it a couple of times reminded me the bookies and who people thought would win the Queensland state election both got it wrong. So, having said that, it was quite interesting to find that news poll at the beginning of the week also showed that health and Medicare had taken over as the most important of the very important issues, knocking the economy down to second place. So, as Stephen was saying, that health has come up as something that is an issue that is at play in the election, and maybe we'll have a discussion on how much at play and what it may contribute to a victory or a loss. So I'll be brave. And I'll say that at this point of time, we've got 5 weeks to go. So basically, we're going into what we think is a usual election campaign from this week. I do remind you that in 2004, Mark Latham led the Howard coalition government by 5 points in news poll going into the poll. And it wasn't until the last week in 2004 that the electors, if you can believe the pollsters, rushed back to Howard. So it could well be that either side could see a late rush to break what we really have is a deadlock. The political analyst Andrew Katsaris told me this morning that when he puts all the numbers or aggregates all the published polls, even the latest one with Reachtel last night, the average is about 50.1 to Labor, which is basically statistically 50-50. So we've had that deadlock now for 3 weeks, and neither Shorten nor Turnbull have been able to break through. Will they break through? I don't know. I suspect we may get a 98 result where the coalition government wins more seats, maybe 77, maybe 79. They need, 76? But it could be that Labor gets 50.1% of the vote. We'll see. That's what I'm plugging for at the moment. So that's my overview. Why don't we start with the ladies? Sue, what's your view? Who's winning and who's going to win?
Well, I'm probably the least qualified member of this panel to be talking about that because I'm the health writer, but I would have to say that if you'd asked this question in February, the answer was obvious. Malcolm Turnbull was ahead with an approval rating gap between him and Bill Shorten of 81. That's tumbled to 12. I think potentially that Malcolm Turnbull might come to rue the day that he thought a long election campaign was a good idea. I think that the length of the election campaign is going to give people more time to take a look at Bill Shorten. They hadn't rated him until it started. He's done some surprising things. He's taken a stand on some risky policies like negative gearing that made people sit up and take notice. I think that you're in a situation in Australian politics where everybody's fed up with political parties that just want to play political games. They're looking for someone who is prepared to take the time to govern the country, to look at the hard policy decisions that need to be made. I think that perhaps the Labor's risky stand on negative gearing is making people think perhaps they can do that. The one legacy that Kevin Rudd has left the Labor Party is that he's solved their leadership problems for them. Everybody thought that was a mistake when Bill Shorten had a low opinion profile, but now, after what happened with the leadership challenge with Tony Abbott, at least the leadership on the Labor side is looking a little bit more stable, and that could go in their favour. The polls today have them ahead, but there's 5 weeks to go. Anything can happen in an election campaign. I certainly wouldn't be prepared to call it at this stage.
Mel?
I think there's an underrated issue here, and that's stability. And it's close relation continuity. You've got to remember that if there is a change of government, Australia will have seen its 5th Prime Minister in just a smidgen over 3 years. 3 years in a matter of days. And I'm not saying that will prevent people from voting for the Labor Party, but it is an element of this deep-seated and, as I say, understated, underrated desire in the electorate for some sort of stability. One of the most telling comments I've ever heard from a bloke in the street, and you do, we all do, you get stopped occasionally and someone wants to give you their pet theories. A bloke stopped me and he said, "They keep making up shit to tax." And I thought that was a very telling comment because it was a desperate cry from the heart. I mean, what are these people doing? And he could have been referring to everything from negative gearing to a visit to your GP. I think that Bill Shorten is performing very well, but let's face it, the only way he could have gone is up, given his figures at the start of the campaign. I think Malcolm Turnbull will hit his stride. He's starting to do so now that he's got a solid issue to grasp onto. He's not very good at faking it with scare campaigns, Malcolm Turnbull, but he's sort of this limp sort of chap we've seen over the last couple of weeks. But with the economic debate ramping up, we're suddenly seeing what I call funky East Sydney Turnbull. He's out there and he's rocking. We'll see if he can keep that up for another 5 weeks or so. But I would guess from this point, and so many things could change, that we'll see a return of the Turnbull government.
Laura.
Yeah. So we all get very scientific about election results and polls and all those sorts of things. But I suppose you can look at all of those numbers, and they're all very important and they tell us things. But I just observe Bond was quoting the news poll figure on expectations of who's going to win, which I think really is a huge number. And the Fairfax Ipsos poll, which came out 5 days earlier, actually showed the number going in the opposite direction, that 57% of people think that Malcolm Turnbull or the coalition will win. Now, I'm not spruiking one poll or the other as more reliable, but I think that factor is important. And that goes to the broader point I'd make, which you can all ask yourselves. Do you feel like the shift is on? You know, does it feel like people are going, yeah, we've had enough of this mob, you know, rack off, we want somebody different? And I think that's the thing that's missing so far in this campaign, which is what makes it really interesting, despite the fact it's really boring. I mean, you've got this sort of lack of enthusiasm for change, which Malcolm's talking about. People just going, oh, for God's sake, do we really want another Prime Minister? Yet we've got this really galvanising campaign where the opposition has come from nowhere, and it's not about personality, it's about matters of substance. It's about health, it's about education. And I don't know how many of you saw the first leaders' debate, which was a People's Forum out in Western Sydney that Sky showed. And it was fascinating because it was unscripted, unscreened questions from the audience. Now, they weren't very articulate questions. Not that I'm saying most journalists' questions are articulate, but they weren't articulate questions, but they were all on issues that Bill Shorten is addressing. And you could see Malcolm Turnbull just sitting there going, what do I do with this? You know, because if a journalist asked him one of these wide-ranging, slightly rambling questions, he'd do what any politician does and just nail the bit that he wanted to do. But this forced both leaders to come in and try to work out what was behind the question and try to answer it. And Shorten did that much better. Now, so you've got this dynamic with this leader who nobody gave any credit to. They've, and on the basis of being brave and having a reasonably coherent policy platform, if you were asking the question who deserves to win, I think you could probably say, well, at the moment, Labor. But will that happen? I think not. Going back to the science, we carried a story during the week that said Labor's picking up a lot of votes in its own seats, which is always a bit of a tragedy for any party. And I think at the moment there is also that 1993 feeling, which is we want to sort of give Malcolm Turnbull a go. We're still waiting to see the real Malcolm, and there's a frustration with Turnbull that he is not what people thought he would be, whatever that was. But I think they sort of keep hoping he'll come good. So I would at this stage say that the likelihood is that Malcolm Turnbull will be returned with a much reduced majority.
Andrew.
Well, I began this campaign saying to my mates I thought it was going to be Turnbull by 3 seats. So I think it's going to be pretty close. I think there has to be a correction because that's the nature of things. We look at recent past in Australia, and changing government is a very emotional act. And as Laura was suggesting, you know, there is not that emotion around, I see, of, you know, getting rid of a government in disgust, as we saw in 2013, or deciding let's go with something fresh and new and exciting, as we saw in 2007. I don't see any of those. I don't see another chemistry that's particularly dangerous when it comes to shifting government. That said, the polls are fascinating, and it, you know, dare I be a bit more scientific about it. If you look at the 2010 election, where Julie Gillard she didn't win, she had to negotiate a victory, and the primary vote was 37.99, so 38% is basically, 38% primary vote is the absolute rock bottom that a party can be at and still get a victory of sorts, a negotiated victory, albeit. And none of the polls suggest that Labor's near there. Reach Tell, and I was talking to our pollster because he's our pollster for 7 West Media, and his polls has Labor at about 36 and a bit, and they haven't quite got to 37, they haven't quite got to 38. So I just don't see that Labor can do it. But I do agree, Bonge, that you could have that really weird 1998 scenario where, because of the way the seats fall, you have the victory going to the incumbent, but the opposition wins the popular vote. That's a distinct possibility. The other thing about this campaign is this, and a cabinet minister was saying this to me a couple of days ago, that if this were a real, ordinary campaign, then it would be beginning on Monday. But we've been going for 3 weeks, and we've got 8 weeks where you have the two political leaders given equal status, and that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in Parliament. It only happens in election campaigns. So for 2 months, they're actually given equal status. And they're given equal status on the ABC by mandate. And having worked at the ABC during the 2004 election, I remember, and I was in Tasmania, we had to keep a running count of how many seconds we gave Mark Latham and how many seconds we gave John Howard in bulletins. It was that nuts, and it was really bloody frustrating because of course sometimes news is news and the news is with one side or the other, but you were obligated as the national broadcaster to give equal status to the two leaders, and that's a great advantage, you would think, in this campaign with Bill Shorten, and he's certainly running a pretty good campaign, because they've been in effect running the same game as they're running now for the past 2 years, whereas Malcolm Turnbull's team is relatively new. He hasn't campaigned before and many of his staff hadn't. So I think Malcolm Turnbull by 3.
Okay, it's interesting that the point you were making about Labor's primary vote, that is certainly the view of key Labor strategists. One said to me that they really do need to win seats in Queensland, and one of them said to me, the problem we've really got this time is we haven't got Campbell Newman and we haven't got Tony Abbott.
But what they do have is that 11% vote for Clive Palmer's party. And this is one of the factors that makes it a lot more difficult to tell what's going to happen in this election campaign, because 11% of people voted first for Palmer across Queensland in the last election, and nobody knows where those votes are going to go. They're not necessarily Labor votes or coalition votes, they're pissed off votes. And in South Australia you have this Xenophon phenomenon where he's polling and has polled between 25 and 30% of the primary vote. Now that's a reflection of the Senate vote, but he's showing up very strongly in polling in individual seats for House of Reps, and nobody knows what's going to happen there either. So between Palmer, the Greens and Xenophon, just what's going to happen to the two-party preferred vote, I think is very, very difficult to tell.
Just on that, I'd be interested for people to jump in. Everyone assumes, probably rightly historically, although at state level it's been a bit different, that the Greens will take seats from Labor, so that would not, affect the Liberal or the national vote. But I was told that, and this is based on the fact that the Greens won a state seat within Kelly O'Dwyer's seat, federal seat in Melbourne, and maybe this is utter wishful thinking, that don't think that the Greens can't cause a lot of real damage even in seats that look at face value that they're safe Liberal. So, I mean, it could well be that a minority government has to negotiate with a Xenophon candidate, a Green candidate, and some other independent. I was just thinking, maybe we could just very briefly, because we do want to get onto the health politics. Malcolm, do you have any view on what might happen with the Senate, in the sense that we do know that why we have a double dissolution election is that there was a view within certainly the government that the Senate was utterly recalcitrant, and why don't we just wipe them all out and start again and see if we end up better than we have been in the last 3 years with a more compliant Senate. Do you think that is a possibility, a more compliant Senate for the Coalition?
No.
All right, move on, Bongi.
You've got two factors. One is the double dissolution, meaning the quotas are halved. Secondly, the change in the Senate voting rules, which mean you can vote for a micro-party or an independent till your eyeballs bleed. You don't have to worry about preferences. You don't have to even... Not a skerrick of your vote in the form of preferences need go to the Liberal Party or the Labor Party or the National Party. Which means, look out, Pauline's on the way. Her 10th attempt at an election victory in 20 years, and she might just crawl over the line. Pauline Hanson, one of the dumbest people ever to be in Parliament, because of these factors, might get up in Queensland, and the Queenslanders should be ashamed of themselves. Me being a Queenslander, I'd like to add.
But didn't she get over 4% last time, which meant that she got her money back? So it just shows you she's already got the market to pluck.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's an outrageous assertion there, Andrew. The
About
money went
your
to
state.
the Pauline Hanson's a terrific woman party, of which she just had a tangential relationship. Look, it'll be interesting to see how people do use these new Senate voting laws. It's possible there might be more informals in the Senate count than previously, but if over the coming weeks, and particularly in the final 2 weeks, the electorate is educated into the potential of these new rules, which essentially is that you control your preferences. You don't get these shifty preference harvesters diverting them to a preferred candidate. You can decide where they go. You are in control of your vote more than you have been for the last, since 1983 or so. If that happens, then we might see a more stable Senate, but I think it is going to end up to be all over the shop.
I think that the point too is that Don Chipp educated us all to think that, keep the bastard honest, that the Senate is a house of review, and a rubber stamp Senate really is not something that Australians seem to want or appreciate. And in fact, even governments can have policies that they know that their heartland would like, but that aren't really resonating more broadly out in the electorate. And the Senate can save prime ministers from themselves. And some say that John Howard, because he didn't have a Senate saving it from himself with work choices, probably now wishes he didn't have the numbers in the Senate. Does anyone want to add to that before we move on? The other thought occurs to me, Laura, that it could well be that if a government just scrapes through, if the coalition just scrapes through and doesn't have the numbers in the Senate, then we won't have a joint sitting because they won't have a majority to get the IR bills through. That's just a possibility, isn't it?
It's a possibility. I still think the likelihood is that there will be a rough majority and thus a joint sitting. But I think one of the other really interesting fallouts from all of this is whether it's a very small majority that Malcolm Turnbull wins or it's a minority government. The other factor about the Senate is that basically it's all the kooks and dunderheads of parties who end up there. I mean, you always end up with some good people as well, but...
Queenslanders.
You look at who's on the Liberal ticket in the regard of this particular point I make. I mean, Cory Bernardi, Erica Betts and others are coming back to the Senate, and if Malcolm Turnbull is returned with a much smaller number, the likelihood is that we might see a repeat of 2004 where some of those senators effectively become the crossbench. As Barnaby Joyce, I don't know if you'll remember, Barnaby Joyce was effectively the balance of power senator in 2004. Now, that suggests that the coalition should have an absolute majority in the Senate, which isn't going to happen, but nonetheless, their relative power within the coalition party room will increase, and of course that will spell trouble for the Prime Minister.
Okay.
Well, I just say that on the Senate front, as to you as doctors, that the result there could matter very much, because some of the key health cuts that the federal government wants to implement are stuck in the Senate. the increase in the $5 increase in the prescription charge and the pathology cuts that it wants to implement could be overturned by the government, and the fact that the government realises it can't control the Senate is the reason that you're stuck with a Medicare freeze, because you don't need to get that through the Senate. And that's why the government's gone down that path to try and save money in other areas of health.
Sue, thanks for introducing health, because I think we could move on to that now. Just in broad terms, as a health writer takes particular interest and has for a long time, how do you think Catherine King as the shadow is shaping up against Susan Lee as the minister? How would you rate their performances? How significant is the way either woman is handling the issues and the area?
Well, I'd have to say that Susan Lee is a distinct improvement on her predecessor. That she has taken some of the really hard policy issues in the health area seriously. When the Abbott government dumped the co-payment, we did a piece where we interviewed all of the health experts around Australia and said, well, where to next? They can't get this through. What should they be doing in health to save money? And she has implemented a lot of those things that the experts were asking for. She set up the MBS review, which is looking at waste in the health system. She set up a mental health policy which operates like the NDIS, where patients are treated as individuals and given individualised packages. And she listened to doctors, and she's introduced the concept of a medical home. All of those are serious policy reforms, and she should be applauded for them. Her key problem is that she doesn't have any money to fund them. She's got the plans in place, but she doesn't have any money to make them work properly, and she herself admitted this week that she's got lots of things she'd like to do in health, but finance and treasury are stopping her. On the Labor side, to date we haven't seen all of their health policy. They have agreed to wind back, that will stop the freeze on Medicare rebates, which will be welcomed by doctors and no doubt by patients. They've also said that they won't increase the cost of prescriptions by $5 from January next year, as the government promises to do. To date in the election campaign, there's been lots of minor announcements because I don't think either side has got a lot of money to spend. I don't think you're going to see any huge reforms announced. So for health, even though it is the key policy in this election according to voters, I don't think we're going to see any revolutions. All you can hope for is to try and stem the tide of some of the cuts that the government has introduced if you vote for one side of politics.
Andrew, the freeze, how is this playing politically? Could we see the situation that if the deadlock continues and the election looks very touch and go, that the government might relent on the freeze? I mean, do you think that the co-payment by stealth campaign that we're particularly hearing from the Labor Party, but also the intervention of the AMA in this, do you think that it will resonate? Do you think that there's any room for the government to move on here?
Yeah, look, I think there is going to be some leverage here that the doctors can use, in the AMA in particular. But I went back to, I've got this theory that Stephen Duckett said, I think it was last year, he pointed out that when you look at the Medicare growth, 47% of the growth in expense is actually from decisions that Tony Abbott made as health minister. And it's quite a remarkable thing, that, because remember, Tony Abbott said the coalition was Medicare's best ever friend and so on, and the stats actually show that was the case. But what's happening now is that Abbott, when he became Prime Minister, is trying to undo a lot of that fact that he saw it in the system. And the Medicare freeze is a classic one. So I wanted to go, I've looked back at the numbers, because the co-payment by stealth with the freeze effectively tries to undo what Tony Abbott did in 2004, 2005. Now, Sue and I in particular,
he gave you all a $5. He increased the Medicare rebate for a doctor's visit by $5, which effectively, as I calculated, gave every GP a $50,000 pay rise.
Yeah, but
so that's why you saw the increase in Medicare expenditure.
So I've had a look at some of the numbers. So he took the schedule fee, what patients get back from 85% to 100% of the schedule fee, right? In modern day money, that actually took it from $34. So this is modern day money. It took it from $34.70 to $40.80, right? So we can see that the actual, and now it's what, $37.05. So the actual value of that patient rebate has gone down over time, but we're not at the political crunch point where it became this huge business in question time. I remember the early 2000s when Sue and I were doing political, health politics for news at the time. Question time was dominated by the bulk billing rate. And the bulk billing rate was in the 60s in some states and 70s, and it slowly crept up. Now the government now says that it's between 78 and 85, depending on whose numbers you use.
It's its highest level ever. And, and that's why this is not such a big political issue for the government, because people are not seeing this in their medical bills.
And you wonder whether it's going to take another $3 creep in the actual value of the patient rebate to effectively be what it was back in 2004 before they do act. But I mean, it is a GP payment by stealth, but when you look at the numbers, you can see that they're just trying to undo what Tony Abbott did to fix a political problem.
But so far you've got threats of bulk billing ending, but you haven't actually seen it end, and I'm not sure that patients are going to take it seriously. I mean, for the first time ever, you've got medicos launching a campaign similar to the campaign that pharmacists run to protect their own profits. They're using posters in their surgeries. For the first time ever, you're using prescription pads to get your message across. So it will be interesting to see how powerfully that plays out and how seriously patients are going to take it. But the problem you've got is there's an oversupply of doctors. It's very hard for a medical practice to move away from bulk billing. And I think the most interesting thing about where we're at in health policy at the moment is that for decades the AMA fought Medicare. It used to back private billing. Now you're in a situation where the RACGP and the AMA and every medical group in the country, every medical business in the country is backing bulk billing. That is an unprecedented and interesting development in health policy, and it means that Medicare has now become embedded in our political and health system to the extent that businesses in the health space want to defend it.
The really weird thing to me about health politics, this is sort of more the overview of it, is it does show up as one of the big issues for voters, yet we've basically got this sort of effectively a blank space. Yes, the freeze is there as an issue, but Labor's policy is basically, a negative policy. We won't do what they're doing. But for both sides now, you have this sense that the coalition's policy structure has collapsed effectively post-2014 election, and the measures aside that Sue's mentioned, that Susan Lay's been looking at, they really don't have an architecture for where they want to take health policy. And we don't really have one for the Labor Party either. Given it's such a huge issue, given that there's all this campaigning, you would think that one side or other would be able to construct sort of more of a coherent story about what they think they should do. But we've actually got the coalition going into this election on both health and education with policy collapses, which they're trying to keep in witness protection, and a very unclear view of where health policy is going to go under either side of policy.
I think one of the, I agree with you entirely. I think one of the factors of this election is that I've never experienced an election campaign in which spending projections of 10 years plus and money in billions and billions of dollars, not one or two, but masses of money, have so dominated the election debate so far in these first 3 weeks. We seem to have forgotten about the consequence of of this spending, who it affects on the ground and how. It's a distorted and artificial debate, I'm afraid. There was a veteran American Republican called Everett Dirksen, who died 20 years ago, but he was a vibrant old fellow, and once on a late night TV show talking about government spending, he said, well, there's $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and before you know it, you're talking real money. Now, this identifies perfectly a politician's view of spending. It's all about the billions, you know. So this campaign, we've got people whom you wouldn't trust to tell you what's going to happen next Thursday, telling you what's going to happen in 2030. They really do take the voters for granted, and voters are just not that silly. When you have voters worrying about where they're going to get a 200 grand deposit for a house for their kids somewhere, and whether that house will be in a place that doesn't require an hour each way commute to get to work, and whether it's near schools, and you have these characters up there saying it's $67 billion. No, it's only $32 billion. No, it's 67. They're speaking a different language, and they are milking basic services like health for dough. Susan Lee just said the bleeding obvious when she came out and said Finance and Treasury wouldn't allow her to knock off the rebate freeze. It was there. It was put there for the money. To hell with the service. And the same with the Labor Party. The Labor Party will tell you that their negative gearing policy is all about house prices. Rubbish. It's about revenue. And both sides seem to be forgetting the punter on the ground as they toss these massive figures around.
Now, if anyone would like to ask questions, you'll notice that there's a microphone either side of the hall here, and maybe if you line up behind a microphone, and I'll come to you. Just to round out something that occurred to me when Laura was speaking about bulk billing. One of the big changes I think we've seen over the years in the positioning of the AMA in the broader body politic is that people are now seeing that the jibe, you might remember that Keating described the AMA as the most militant trade union in Australia. But I think successfully, and I think people like Brendan Nelson and his successors at the head of the AMA should take a lot of credit for this. People are now seeing that the doctors aren't only on their own side, but they're on the side of their patients. And so the campaign on the Medicare co-payment and bulk billing, people understand if I can go to a doctor and I'm bulk billed, I'm not having to put my hand in my own pocket, and I can go to the doctor when I feel I need to. So there's a mutual benefit there which has come about with a lot of hard work. And I'll just quickly, I know there's a lot of people, I do want to say that the way in which the doctors have stood up to the politicians on the issue of the health care of asylum seekers, especially the ones in Brisbane, that was courageous, and it won doctors in this country, I think, a lot of respect, because it said we are doctors and we look after people. We have someone lined up. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Xavier. I'm a radiology fellow in Melbourne. My question is really to the panel about bulk billing of services apart from general practice. So general practitioners will refer patients to have blood tests, and from my point of view they'll have imaging tests as well. Is that on the radar at all in terms of the public health debate? Because the AMA has done a fantastic job obviously with the GP campaign, but have you heard anything much about anything beyond that for specialists, medical imaging and pathology?
Well, I think absolutely, and in that debate, which I don't think many of you would have watched on Sky, the first People's Forum, that issue is obviously biting, because Malcolm Turnbull unveiled during that People's Forum that he'd reached a deal with pathology to shut down the threat of a $20 charge for a blood test. on analysis afterwards, he had not actually done a deal with the entire pathology profession. He'd done a deal with half the pathology profession. One company, Sonic, has agreed not to pass on the $20 charge. If you talk to primary health care, if you talk to Lavity Pathology and any of the small pathology providers, they say they're not part of that deal. They still are in the position where they're saying they will have to introduce a $20 charge for a blood test after the election. With radiology, the same situation applies. The government there is cutting the Medicare rebate for scans, ultrasounds, x-rays, those sorts of things. It hasn't reached a deal with that profession. As far as I'm aware, they still intend to go ahead with increases in charges and ending bulk billing. That has not resonated much as an issue. I don't think the radiologists have taken the same stand the pathologists did. They did not have a petition going. They have been working quietly with the government but have gained nothing. The only people to win out of the pathology deal with the government is one company which will have to pay less rent to GPs. That puts further pressure on GPs. It means not only are you not going to get an increase in your Medicare rebate, it means that the government is going to allow a situation where pathology company Sonic Healthcare can cut the amount that it pays you for rent if it has a collection centre in your GP practice.
Importantly, I think they're also booking them money still, aren't they, in the forward? So I mean that just shows you that it's more of a political device than anything to get them through to July 2nd.
Yes, sir.
I'm John Buntine, a Victorian surgeon. And I want to take the opportunity to ask about something that Dr. Michael Wooldridge, of course a previous health minister, advised doctors in Victoria quite recently. And he was talking about how effectively the AMA dealt with government in comparison with other groups, and particularly he mentioned pharmacists. And he said the pharmacists were well organised, they knew exactly what they wanted, and the things they didn't get one time they asked for the next time. And he was talking a lot about groups building up long-term relationships with people in government and this sort of thing. And he just was suggesting that doctors were just not in the picture as far as is dealing with government now. It was rather surprising. I just wonder what you feel about that.
What do you think, Laura? I think Dr. Wooldridge is wrong myself.
Yeah, I would dispute that. I think there are a couple of things. One of them is there's the Pharmacy Guild, and then there's so I suppose that's pharmacists, and then of course there's Big Pharma, and I think you have to sort of think about the way the debates go about pharmaceuticals and things there. It's a slightly different environment as a result. You've got the pharmaceutical companies, which are immensely powerful, and the Pharmacy Guild, which has a slightly different brief, but they're sort of got a bit of a pincer movement sometimes on government and politicians. I would sort of echo what Paul said about the way the AMA has worked, particularly in the last 10 years, but certainly post-2014. I think it's been incredibly effective at getting these issues up and running, whether it's been the GP freeze, whether it's been the medical workforce. That you've had good advocates out there who've been both articulate to the point of, saying things where you go, oh, I can't believe that they actually just said that, which is sort of fun as far as I'm concerned. But they have made a point with the government. They haven't just been an irritant. They've kept the debate going, despite the fact that the last minister was, let's face it, a bit of a log. They kept things going, so I would sort of, I'd say that both lobby groups, if you want to look at it that way, have been effective in their own way, but I don't think the Pharmacy Guild has necessarily been more effective than the doctors.
I think one of the differences, one of the differences is that the AMA now has a reputation for consumer advocacy, where the pharmacists are just looking after their market, and they're hoping to expand the position they hold in the market. I mean, if they had your way, there'd be TAB agencies in your local pharmacy. They spend almost all their time and money protecting that very valuable market, and not so much in protecting the interests of their customers.
And the key difference is that the Pharmacy Guild has a 5-year deal with the government. Every 5 years, the government is forced to come to the table and negotiate with chemists about how much they're going to pay them. Doctors don't have that situation. And the Pharmacy Guild is known as the most powerful lobby group in Canberra because it always gets its way. It has managed to construct a monopoly for its profession in owning pharmacies, and every 5 years it comes up with ways of protecting its profits. That's not a luxury the AMA has. And the reason the Guild has wielded such political power is it's prepared to use those suburban chemists as political campaign centres. And the AMA, until recently, has not been prepared to do that. That's why I'm interested in the fact that you are now using your GP surgeries in this campaign to conduct a campaign against the freeze. You're using your prescription pads to do it. I think you're learning from the Guild, and I think it'll be interesting to see whether that has any impact politically.
Yeah, I would think that Wooldridge is speaking or reflecting his experience with the Pharmacy Guild, that they were the hardest nut to crack in his time. I mean, there are lots of little symptoms of there being still a problem with the use of pharmaceuticals, for example. I mean, Australia's got a really high volume of big brand drugs when you can get cheaper generics, often what I think they're called pseudo-generics, where they're simply exactly the same drug, not just, copies thereof, but exactly the same drug that's made in the same factory floor, that's repackaged and sold to Alpha Pharm to sell as a generic. I mean, this sort of stuff is just symptomatic of a system that's been stitched up by the pharmacists because they can get their little brand price premiums and whatnot through selling the big name drugs. So, I mean, that's just, I know that the generic, so correct me if I'm wrong, but generic prescriptions have gone slightly higher over the years, but it's nowhere near what happens in Europe or Britain or the United States.
But I think the big lesson of this, and I guess we'll move on because we want to get a few other things. The big lesson of this, which I think the AMA has realised, is that perceptions that you can be taken for granted by one side of politics rather than the other will get you nowhere. And I think that the government has certainly got the message that the AMA is issue-centred rather than trying to look after its mates in the coalition or whatever. And if you're going to wield any sort of political influence, that's the message. You've got to grab them by the short and curlies or they won't take any notice of you.
So, Bonge, can I just make one more? The only other advantage that the pharmacists have over the AMA is that they are certainly perceived within the coalition as small to medium-sized enterprises, small business, and the government is terrified always of offending small business.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, no, you've been over there. Sorry, I did notice you earlier. Thank you.
Gino Pecoraro, I'm an obstetrician gynaecologist from Brisbane. I'm interested if the panel thinks that the health minister or the opposition health spokesman get the idea of unintended consequences of policy thought bubbles that they have. What I mean by that is with the taking of money out of the Medicare system, with things like the freeze, the unintended consequence is that you have a group of people who traditionally used to access private medicine for their care. The rebates no longer match what they have to pay, and when they go to hospital, the rebates are meaningless. And all private health insurance gets you is a bed in a hospital. It really pays nothing terribly much towards the cost of everything else that goes on. So what happens is that people who need services are forced to go access the public sector, which is funded by the state government. There is no increased capacity in that sector, and so you've got private federally funded hospitals sitting idle and public hospitals on their ear. I'm interested, one, do you think the politicians get it? And two, why don't you as the health journalists make more of a deal about that, because that's what we see in the community?
blame shifting. Sue, you're a health journalist. Defend yourself.
Disgraceful, Sue.
Well,
No, I didn't say
I hope
disgraceful.
that, if you read what I write, that those are exactly the sorts of problems that I try to delve into. And I think I did a piece recently which is looking at what's going on in public hospitals. Nearly half the beds in public hospitals are now paid for by health funds, as the cash-strapped state hospitals are desperately trying to get an extra $1 billion of revenue each year out of health funds. And that's, talking about unintended consequences, the unintended consequence of that is it's pushing up our health fund premiums by $250 a year. And it means the taxpayer is paying once for that hospital bed through the tax system, then again through a subsidy for private health insurance for the same hospital bed. I do know, having spoken to him, that the head of the health department is acutely conscious of the fact that you do one thing in health and it has domino effects right throughout the entire system, which I think in some senses can almost be paralysing as a policy maker about what can you do to solve the problem, because if you solve one problem this way, you're going to create another problem in this sector. And that is part of the wicked problem of trying to solve some of the health.
Well, this is also gets down to the sort of the conflict between the compulsion to get private health insurance and the universality of Medicare. Can I make a confession, Bongi?
Go right ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was 18 months ago. This kind of shows you how the health system works to patients' benefit and guilt. But I was in a soccer clash. I got elbowed rather heavily by a goalkeeper about 2 years ago, and I had 4 breaks here. Just basically, I couldn't open my mouth. I'd broken my cheekbone, and it was quite hurt actually. And and I thought, oh God, this is going to cost me an arm and a leg. And I went to Canberra Hospital, and I was in a pretty poor state actually, and I was thinking, does my private health insurance cover this? And because I was injured so badly, I was totally covered by Medicare. And the irony is, if I'd been hurt a wee bit less, I wouldn't have got the Medicare priority. And so there was no compulsion on me, even though I've had private health insurance for practically all of my working life, and I was certainly covered. Well, must have been covered most of my time in Australia. But there was no compulsion for me to use it.
Well,
do you think I should have?
No, I have been forced to buy private health insurance by government policy, and my motto in life is never to use it, because I know the minute I use it, I will be out of pocket to the tune of thousands of dollars. So I've had 2 babies in the public health system. When my father-in-law was very ill recently and had to go to hospital, he's got health insurance. The first question he was asked when he walked through the door in emergency is, do you have private cover? And I said, Les, the answer to that question is always no. Because, I have personally had to subsidise the out-of-pocket expenses of my dying mother-in-law to the tune of $10,000. We could not afford to do that a second time around. There's something crooked at the heart of the private health system in this country that needs to be fixed.
But do you think that's a fundamental bind, though, that you
there
can
are
be
many
compelled to
doctors,
have it,
there
but
are
they're
many
not compelled to use it?
surgeons who are charging outrageous fees. I have spoken to families who, pensioner families who had $8,000, that was their entire life savings, and they've spent it getting one single operation, on the out-of-pocket expenses for one single operation. Now, we're in a situation where government policy forces us to have health insurance, and it doesn't cover the cost of your health care. And you're in a situation where, as the National Health Reporter, I know the answer to the question, do you have private health insurance? It's always no, unless you are desperately in need of a hip replacement, and it's the only way that you can get into
All
a
I can say to
hospital and
Andrew,
jump the queue.
this will have to be the last question, is that right? All right, good, yeah, excellent. Is that I'll absolve you, Andrew, but I'm not sure that the Territory Health Minister would.
Andrew Pesher, nice to ask you a question, Sue, rather than the other way around. I guess, there's always, within the AMA, there's always this sort of angst, there's always accusations that the incumbent president sort of tends to be a bit too biased one way or the other. I mean, my personal experience is there's a tension between trying to encourage an almost nihilistic coalition to actually have some health policy rather than just cost controls, and rein in the over-ambitious reformist expectations of the Labor Party. I mean, do you think that essentially the AMA sort of gets it right? What are the things that help us get it right, and when do we step over the line?
Well, the thing I say to every health lobby group that I ever speak to in the sector is the thing you've got to remember, and the guiding principle of my journalism, is it's not about your profession, it's about the patient. And if what you want to achieve is something that's going to improve healthcare for the patient or the costs of the patient, then you're probably getting it right, because I don't think it needs to be about doctors' incomes. I don't think it needs to be about pharmacy profits or pharmaceutical company profits. If what you're asking for is going to benefit the patient, then I think you're on the right track.
Thank you.
Richard Kidd, I'm a co-founder of Doctors for Refugees. Thank you for the kind comments about the activities in Brisbane.
Well, thank you.
Perhaps a comment on the schism in the Australian voting psyche around the health and other things for asylum seekers and refugees. How is it that Australians can be voting knowing that the policy is deliberate harm of these most vulnerable people who get here very, very sick with great health needs, and yet they're being sent off to places as remote as Nauru and Parnis, and we're seeing people dying and seeing others that are dreadfully, dreadfully sick, and yet it seems that a lot of Australians are voting for this. Can you give us some insight into why it is so difficult to get people to see how wrong it is?
Well, I think this then comes down to when we get to vote once every 3 years, we have one vote and there are many issues. And Mel, I'll come to you on this, and it is my view on the whole asylum seeker issue is that Australians would like the boats to stop, and they don't really want to know how, and they don't want to see what you're doing, you know. So we're a bit, I used to be able to say schizophrenic on this, but you can't say that anymore. But we sort of want to have our cake and eat it too. We're a bit caught up on it. And it does seem that the whole issue is given more weight in certain parts of Australia than in others. This is, interesting in itself. Mel, what do you think in answer to the good doctor's query?
It goes back to a basic sense of insecurity within the electorate that's shared by people who vote for both major parties. They have this fear, and they're not talked out of it very much, that all sorts of dark brown people are going to come in and take welfare that should be theirs, take jobs that should be theirs, arguably at the same time, according to our immigration minister. It's I guess it's part of our geography as an Anglo-Celtic nation in the Asian region, but it's persistent. Plus, there's a certain practical imperative here. If people are allowed to come into a country of just 23 million people, how can we handle the flow? But what gets me is, I agree with you that this leads to an acceptance of making an absolute misery of the lives of people in Nauru and on Manus. How on earth do we accept, the policy is to be harsher than the other bloke, and there seems to be this contest. The second thing that gets me is how do we tolerate the incompetence of this immigration minister? Peter Dutton, he spent 44 million and there are 9 people have gone to Cambodia? Is it? It's got up to shot up to 9?
Well, I heard on the ABC this morning that we've sent 9, but only 1 remains there.
Only 1 remains there. These were processing centres. They weren't meant to be detention. They were processing centres. People were supposed to go through and leave somewhere else. And if that is not happening, it's because the minister and stroke the government is incompetent. And Peter Dutton's incompetence was exploded onto our screens last week when he had that rant against refugees, which simply didn't make sense. I refer you back to their welfare sponges who take our jobs. It was a harsh. he was declaring an entire section of Australian population as second rate. How do we put up with a bloke like that?
Just a thought too, Bruce Baird, who you may remember, is one of the very courageous politicians that in 2001, Liberal politicians, spoke out and paid a political price for it. But he did point out to me, he said, what you've got to understand, especially in Sydney, everyone points to Western Sydney, is there is an element also of fair go here. The sort of messages that were coming back not only to the Liberals but to Labor and Keating and Jerry Hand earlier was, hang on, I've got my grandparents or my husband or my mother-in-law in Lebanon or wherever waiting to come. They've been waiting 5 or 6 years or whatever. We're playing by the rules and you're letting these people in through the back door. So this isn't fair. That was a really strong argument that was around, in the late 90s and the early 2000s.
Well, in fact, most polling shows that the people who are most in favour of the government's immigration policies are migrants themselves, which is...
Yeah, for those reasons, yeah.
Which should be... I suppose I've become really interested in how you changed this argument, and I suspect, as Paul said, I don't, Australians just sort of go, I don't want to know what's happening on Manus and Nauru because we like the policy and we don't want to think about the outcome of it. So I think you have to get a change in the entire, infrastructure of the argument. And if you think about immigration policy post-World War II, it was basically sold as a positive, that it was really good for the country to have all these extra people. Now, we've had, 3 million extra people in the last decade come to Australia and nobody ever talks about that. We go, we don't have enough infrastructure, but we don't say that's because we've got all these people. And they weren't refugees. We wanted them to come here. They've been one of the reasons, apart from the resources boom, why the economy has been stronger. Now, I think you've got to start changing the argument at that level. And I think probably one of the things that may actually be a cut through on this is there's an international change, because Europe is obviously grappling with this and they think about it a bit more pragmatically because they're ageing populations and they need extra workers. And so I think what you'll start to see is people saying, well, we're not, let's face it, there aren't just refugees or not refugees, there's a spectrum of people. I think you'll start to see a debate about getting a spectrum of visas to reflect the circumstances of people, ranging from really dreadful persecution and fear of death and torture to people who are right on the edge of being economic refugees. And I think probably realistically it's in fixing those issues so that people don't see this as being not fair, however irrational you might see that as being. Because I don't think we're going to get anybody sort of suddenly saying, oh, look, I can't stand what's happening on Manus Island and I'm going to fix it now, because nobody knows how to do that within the parameters and constraints of current politics, however ugly they are.
Yes, thank you.
If it's Turnbull by 4 with a feral Senate, what's going to happen and how should the AMA and the medical profession prepare for it?
Andrew?
Well, the government is utterly intent on locking in some of these savings. We have a situation in higher education where the first attempt was a complete failure, but they've still locked in the savings. They're going to have another go at securing $3.5 billion or something in higher education. They're going to have another go at locking in the health savings. I suppose it's going to be, a lot of it depends on how you guys go in the next 5 weeks with your campaign. But as alluded to before, I think the problem that you've got on, say, the Medicare freeze is that there's not that crunch at the moment with patients fearing bulk billing going. And I think that because the numbers are relatively high, but doctors are still incredibly trusted, more so than journalists, I might add. And so you've got a currency to spend that many people most people in society don't have, but it's a currency you would have to be very careful about wasting. Whereas I think at Capitol Hill, the Pharmacy Guild, for example, is kind of looked on with a bit more suspicion than the AMA, and I'm talking about the press gallery as well, you'd want to be careful about making any overblown statement, but being cool, calm, and the reliable and reassuring people that the GPs are, a family doctor is, and the surgeons are as well.
Okay. Yes, thank you.
My name's Sarah Whitelaw and I'm an emergency physician from the Royal Melbourne Hospital. We've heard this morning from our medical students that the focus on broader health social issues is extremely important for that demographic of our profession. And I'm really interested in the panel's perspective on the political impact of the AMA's advocacy on perhaps what some would see as non-core health issues. Does it improve our ability, does it improve our political capital, or does it actually functionally interfere with our ability to work with government on our core health issues? So,
can you just clarify for me what you mean by non-core health issues?
Climate change, refugee health, issues that are to do with broader social policy rather than, I guess, core issues to do with the doctor-patient relationship.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that occurs to me immediately is that the people that you're having a one-on-one relationship with live in a world that is, affected by, climate change and has social cohesion based on a shared view of human dignity and human rights. So, and I think that has worked for the AMA rather than against it. Sue, what's your view of that?
Yes, well, I think that when the AMA started to change as an organisation was probably under Brendan Nelson, when he was probably one of the first leaders to look at broader social issues. He held forums on things like unemployment when unemployment was high. Over the years, the AMA's held a number of interesting forums on smoking and alcohol use and various other things which I think have contributed to the public debate. I think it enlarges the area of interest of the association. I mean, obviously there's always two sides to these issues and some people may not support the AMA's approach and you may turn them off, but I think in general it's a positive thing that shows that you have a deep understanding of some of the complex issues that politicians and bureaucrats should be grappling with and have got some intelligent solutions to offer.
You only have to listen to Life Matters on Radio National to realise that people do get the message that health is holistic in a very big sense of the word. And anyone?
And I think people are craving, reliable information. I mean, the great irony of the internet age is that we get less diverse debate on big issues in the media than we used to. That's my feeling. So I think as long as the AMA is entering these debates in a way where it's providing real life experience of doctors in these areas, so people go, oh, here's a new perspective, this is something I hadn't thought about. It's not just because otherwise it becomes an argument between two politicians who are trying to score points off each other. When you make an argument, whether it's about refugees or climate change or anything, something that has real world consequences, not just for individuals, but in the case of climate change for business, for example, the investor forum on climate change, I can't quite think of its title, but it's really good because they come out and say, look, we're investors, by the way, we're not going to invest in companies that do dirty coal things anymore. You think about the transformative role they've played, and I think the same can be said for the AMA having a voice in those broader debates, and I don't think it does, to answer your question, affect the way the government perceives the AMA or other health groups on those sort of more cutting edge issues.
Rob Parker, psychiatrist, Darwin. I just want to get the panel's opinion on what they feel about the cognizance of the voting public and spending promises, because it seems to, I'm almost always aware that the first person to greet the incoming Prime Minister is usually the Secretary of Treasury, and usually after that meeting they say, God, things are twice as bad as we think they are. So I'm just wondering how the panel feel, because obviously, and particularly in respect to the funding the freeze, he seems to be offering stuff, but I'm suspecting he's not going to be able to sort of funded after the election. So do you think the public believe them? Do you think, what do you think the public feel about this?
Mel, this is made for you.
I think there's enormous cynicism about both sides on this issue. And as I was trying to say earlier, we're dealing in massive sums that are just incomprehensible to the ordinary sane person and irrelevant to their lifestyle. The problem for the Labor Party is that the Liberals have a reputation, despite what Labor did in the 80s, which was genuine reform, have a reputation for better economic management. Deserved or not is another matter. So if people are bewildered by the sums and the outrageous projections over 10 plus years, they will stick to their instincts, and their instincts are to back the Liberal Party on economic management.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question because it gets down to lessons that weren't learnt during the GFC, and the lessons not learnt by voters was that, you know, we've gone through this a huge hiccup in world finances, and things are always going to be a bit different. And Labor, and in fact the federal government as a whole, has become a victim of its own success, and the success was actually us avoiding that bus. And if you haven't been hit by a bus like the rest of the world was with the GFC, then you don't know what you should be worried about. But I think that when you had that, you had Jane Holton, who's the Finance Secretary, and Fraser from Treasury, saying in the PFO document the other day that we really need to fix up our finances. They're trying to bring back both sides of politics back to realisation that you do actually need to save. And this is where it becomes quite problematic.
We have time for one last question, and I'll do it, the gentleman on my left.
Oh, thank you. Mark Sinclair, anaesthetist from Adelaide. Just wanted to address, backtrack a bit, the issue of out-of-pocket expenses for privately insured patients. I've been a bit frustrated over the years that I'm constantly portrayed as the villain, in inverted commas, in this issue, which is, to quote a recent article in The Australian, I'd like to ask, where is the pressure on Medicare for 30 years of lousy indexation? Where is the pressure on the private insurers with their billion-dollar profits for their lousy indexation? The cause of out-of-pockets is a combined thing, and largely responsible are Medicare and the private insurers. And I do get a little bit frustrated that guys like me that are very careful, I don't charge $8,000 to my patients or $10,000, but I don't even charge the AMA fee because patients would be significantly out of pocket. I take things very carefully, very considered, and yet I'm painted as the villain. I'd like to see more pressure on the rebates.
Sue?
Well, I'd agree with you that it's not only doctors that are to blame for this. I mean, Michael Wooldridge, when he was Health Minister, did a review of the Medicare benefits schedule which found that doctors across the spectrum were being underpaid for what they did, that the Medicare rebate had not kept pace with inflation, and nothing was done about that because it was going to cost too much. What we saw in intervening years was the same old, same old. The Medicare rebate increased by less than inflation. The AMA fee increased by, the cost of inflation, and we now have a gap between the rebate for a GP and the cost of delivering that service. The Medicare rebate used to cover 85% of it, now it covers less than 50% of it. So yes, I agree with you entirely that something needs to be done about that, and also health insurers, and that flows on to health insurance because the health insurance rebate is based on that, and so is any over the MBS payments that health insurers agree to pay. And yes, health funds should have should be put to pressure on that. But the problem is, if you do that, then you're going to increase the cost of Medicare. The government can't even afford to pay the current Medicare rebates it's got a freeze on. And if you do increase the amount insurers have to pay back, then premiums rise, and they're already rising more than people want. So we need to find some other solution in the middle. I think the MBS review is an opportunity to do that. If we can cut some of the waste out of the system, then hopefully there might be an opportunity to raise Medicare rebates for the services that are worthwhile.
Thanks, Sue, and thank you, panel, and thank you very much for your questions and the discussion. I think it does show that when we discuss issues and don't put them in boxes of left and right, Labor, Liberal, but hang on, let's have a look at the issue and what is the rational way through. And this is the way, of course, when Malcolm Turnbull became Prime Minister, I think he hit the nail on the head when he said this is the way we want it, this is the way Australia wants it. But unfortunately, as we see in an election context, we go back to the old divisions because the way you get votes is you divide people and you paint the other side, no matter what they're saying, as too risky and too dangerous. And that can often mean, for example, that the excesses, for example, on negative gearing, if the Liberals win, they won't be game enough to touch for at least 3 years, you know. So at least some Australians can sit down and discuss issues and think about it without necessarily pointing the fingers at lefties and leftards and rightards and whatever else. So thank you very much, and I wish you well for the rest of your national conference.
So you've heard it from 5 of the most experienced journalists in the country. This is a very tight election. Health is a vote changer, and health is up near, if not at the top of people's considerations. You've also heard something of the complexity of the health debate. Whether it's funding, whether it's the balance between private and public, whether it's the autonomy of the doctor-patient relationship, whether it's the issues of acute care or going way back to the determinants of health, public health, ethical issues. And also we've had the opportunity to hear about how the medical profession and the AMA is perceived across the community by decision makers and the electorate, and there is a fair bit of food for thought about how we have acted over the last 10 or 20 years and how we may behave in the weeks and months and years ahead. We are at a critical time, and I think very few people would disagree with that suggestion. So can I thank those of you who made invaluable comments and questions from the floor across the entire range of health policy. Can I also thank on your behalf Malcolm Farr, Sue Dunlevy, Paul Bongiorno, Laura Tingle and Andrew Probyn. Thank you. And it's back to you, Bev. Okay. Andrew?
Oh, thank you.
Thanks very much. Much appreciated.
Good on you.
Oh, goodie bags.
It's not a show bag.
I might have won ducks at school or something.
It's heavy.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thanks for your time and expertise.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.